Race is such a pervasive idea in modern discourse. Racists nowadays and their academic counterparts try to push the idea of race realism or racialism, the idea that humanity can be easily divided into well-defined categories, races, that are both broad and clearly defined. Said races are different from one another and that these differences can determine the abilities and behaviors of individuals or groups that belong to that race. Where did these ideas originate though? I mean, these sentiments have existed for a long time. Let's take a look at this quote from Aristotle. Those nations are full of spirit but somewhat deficient in intelligence and skill, so that they continue comparatively free, but lacking in political organization and capacity to rule their neighbors. Fairly interesting, isn't it? How far back race realist tendencies go when talking about blacks. Wait, I've been a little cheeky here. Notice that I haven't provided the full quote. Here is the full quote. The nations inhabiting the cold places and those of Europe are full of spirit, but somewhat deficient in intelligence and skill, so that they continue comparatively free, but lacking in political organization and capacity to rule their neighbors. He's talking about the whites of Europe, not of blacks. That was just a little exercise to show how even you and I may have been affected by these notions despite us not believing in them. The very fact that a couple of thousand years ago the supposedly unalienable racial hierarchy was different to those of modern people who subscribe to such ideas should be proof enough as to how ridiculous it all is. Race, especially the modern concept, is a purely European invention, with conveniently Europeans being at the top of said hierarchy. Nonetheless, let's take a look at the semi-modern history of race realism. Now, attitudes of race realism, racialism, were pervasive, especially in supposedly educated circles, since before the French Revolution. Even amongst the more liberal American leaders such as Lincoln, there are statements such as this: "There is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Even in academic circles, where giants like Charles Darwin stood, such sentiments were prevalent and even presented as scientific fact. Darwin himself wrote about a future time when the gap between human and ape will increase by the anticipated extinction of intermediates such as chimpanzees and Hottentots, that being a racial term for the Khoikhoi, a nomadic tribe of people in South Africa. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as at present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Before we get into the deeper stuff, let's see what concepts of race existed among supposedly educated European minds. Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish physician, in his 1735 work Systems of Nature, divided humanity into 5 races. The Americanus: red, choleric, righteous; black, straight, thick hair, stubborn, zealous, free, painting himself with red lines, and regulated by customs. The Europeanus: white, sanguine, browny, with abundant long hair, blue eyes, gentle, acute, inventive, covered with close vestments, and governed by laws. The Asiaticus: yellow, melancholic, stiff, black hair, dark eyes, severe, haughty, greedy, covered with loose clothing, and ruled by opinions. Interestingly, the Asiaticus changed from brown in the first edition of Systems of Nature to yellow in the 10th edition. Finally, the Africanus: black, phlegmatic, relaxed, black frizzled hair, silky skin, flat nose, timid lips, females without shame, mammary glands give milk abundantly, crafty, sly, lazy, cunning, lustful, careless, anoints himself with grease, and governed by caprice. As you can see, only the most scientific descriptors. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers and a physician, believed being black was a hereditary disease called negroidism, a type of leprosy, and that it could be cured. Christopher Meiners, a German philosopher and historian, believed that races could only be divided according to beauty, with, as you may expect, the white race being beautiful and the black race being ugly. He took this nonsense even further, though. He claimed that blacks don't feel emotions or pain, and that they are all carnivores. All this was discovered after he dissected black cadavers. Karl Vogt, a prominent Swiss scientist, claimed that whites are entirely a different species and that blacks were related to apes. Now, this original simple division of 5 races done by Linnaeus grew to 13 with the publication of The Diversity of Origin of the Human Races by Louis Agassiz in 1850. Also in the mid-19th century, Arthur de Gobineau would publish his An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races. De Gobineau is interesting to note for a few reasons. One is that he was a diplomat, and he had no training in any scientific field, let alone anthropology. And two, he was the one to coin the idea of an Aryan race. He divided race into 3 categories: black, yellow, and white. Of course, in his mind, the white race was the most superior. The white race originally possesses the monopoly of beauty, intelligence, and strength. He thought that race mixing was the greatest evil. He further believed that any positive achievements or traits that the yellow or black races had or would have are solely due to mixing, at one point or another, with white people. He also decided that there were subsections of white people, with a pure Germanic race being the ideal example. Funnily enough, though, he was French, and also claimed to be a descendant of Odin. Why is this interesting? Because de Gobineau made friends with Richard Wagner, the radically anti-Semitic German composer and a favorite of Hitler. Wagner supported de Gobineau's work, and after de Gobineau's death, it was picked up and built upon by Wagner's son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Chamberlain was Hitler's mentor and prime supporter. I think you see the connection. Let's distract from this depressing fact through some humor. De Gobineau spent his time as a diplomat in Tehran, Iran. Iran was his prime obsession, claiming that their ancient civilizations were built by a Western European race that has since mixed too much with the Semitic Arabs to be salvaged, despite the fact that there's complete continuity between ancient and modern Iranians. Due to this, he saw Iran being conquered by the West eventually, but warned that Western men would all too easily be seduced by beautiful Persian women, thus causing more miscegenation to further corrupt the West. This strange Orientalist idea was very common with him, actually, as he believed that Asian and black women had immense powers of sexual attraction over white men, and that whenever whites were in close proximity to blacks and Asians, the result was always mixing, as white men were seduced by Asian and black women, to the detriment of the whites. For a supposedly superior race, they sure are bad at self-control. Now let's move on to the meat of history of racism. Rather than give a long series of names explaining the who and where of random people with unfamiliar names that neither you or I will bother to remember, I'd rather give their opinions in the context of the time and how they justified their personal biases, whites being superior to all, through their research. This research eventually became pervasive in academic circles and would trickle down to more educated laymen of the time, and eventually these opinions reached today's race realists in one form or another, in one package or another. Samuel George Morton is one of these unfamiliar names. He was a physician renowned for his collection of human skulls, and his strange belief, entirely based off of traveler reports, that different races of man produce infertile offspring. To give you an idea how influential he was, the New York Tribune wrote after his passing that probably no scientific man in America enjoyed a higher reputation among scholars throughout the world than Dr. Morton. His prime goal was to see if a ranking of races could be established objectively by physical characteristics of the brain, particularly by its size. The idea being the larger the brain, the more intelligent a person is. The more intelligent, the more civilized, endowed with the tools to rule over the less endowed, so on and so forth. Now, the very idea that larger brain equals more intelligent is dubious at best. Brain size is related to the size of the body that houses it. Large people tend to have larger brains than small people. Elephants have way larger brains than human beings. What's important is the ratio of brain size to body size. When applying this metric, the ratio between, for example, men and women are the same, despite men usually being larger and usually having larger brains. This also applies to different groups of people, be they black, Native American, East Asian, etc. The very premise that larger brains equals more intelligent is flawed from the very beginning. Putting that aside, Morton's measurements of skulls themselves were nonsense. He measured them by packing skulls with mustard seeds at first, which provided very shoddy measurements. Undeterred, he moved on to using lead shot, which had a much narrower range for error. From these measurements, he produced 3 tables, 2 of random sets of modern skulls in his possession, and 1 for skulls he got from an ancient Egyptian tomb. Long after many of his beliefs were discredited, these tables were still used as hard evidence for the ranking of races. Conveniently, the results happened to exactly match the racial biases of the author: whites at the top, Native Americans in the middle, and blacks at the bottom. Under the breakdown of whites, Teutons and Anglo-Saxons were at the top, Jews below, and Indians, as in from the Indian subcontinent, at the bottom. This pattern was also supposedly proven by the skulls found in the Egyptian tomb. How interesting. Biology seems to have proven that which egalitarians deny. The truth is, though, that he fudged his numbers. Stephen Jay Gould, in his book The Mismeasure of Man, argues that this fudging was unintentional, but in the end it doesn't really change anything. Now, let's see how he fudged his numbers exactly. In his averaging of cranial capacities amongst differing Native American groups, something very cheeky was done. In his sample of 144 skulls, 36 skulls belonged to the Inca Peruvians, which were of short stature and body size, while the larger-brained Iroquois contributed only 3 skulls. If it were the other way around, his results, which were an average, of course, would have risen by quite a bit. When correcting this little mistake, Gould did this by averaging the mean values for all tribes represented by 4 skulls or more. The mean average, measured in cubic inches, jumps from 80.2 to 83.79. Hold on a minute, you say. Morton's data shows that Caucasian skulls are more than 3 cubic inches larger than the corrected figure. Doesn't that still prove Morton's point? Well, no. He didn't only fudge numbers for the Native Americans. In his Caucasian mean, he omits Indian skulls, as in from the Indian subcontinent, for fear that it will unnecessarily reduce the average of Caucasian skulls. Mind you, he didn't extend this courtesy to the Native American skulls, gladly including the much smaller Inca Peruvian skulls as 25% of the amount of skulls used in that measurement. By restoring Indian skulls to the average and applying the same method of calculation as for Native American skulls, the correct result is 84.45 cubic inches. By accounting for the error range of plus minus 1 cubic inch, the result shows that there is practically no difference between Native Americans and Caucasians. Interestingly, Eskimos, which Morton had a very low opinion of, yield an average of 86.8, yet Morton hides this by lumping them in with the Mongol classification. Morton believed that he had shown that whites were superior to Native Americans in intelligence. Now he wanted to show that the supposed discrepancy between whites and blacks was even greater, and that this has remained unchanged since ancient times. Here's where the skulls from the Egyptian tomb come in. Now, Morton believed that he could identify both races and subgroups among races from features of the skull, a belief that most anthropologists today would deny is possible unambiguously. He divided his Caucasian skulls into Pelasgics, meaning Hellenes, basically Greeks, Jews, and Egyptians, in that order, again confirming Anglo-Saxon preferences. Non-Caucasian skulls he identified either as Negroid, hybrids of Negro and Caucasian with more black than white, or as pure Negro. Now, most of you have already realized what he did with this unnecessary step of subdivision. He simply assigned the largest skulls to his preferred Pelasgic group, and the smallest to Egyptians. If we ignore his separation and combine all 65 Caucasian skulls into a single sample, we get an average capacity of 82.15 cubic inches. If we give Morton the benefit of all doubt and rank his dubious subsamples equally, as we did in computing Native American and Caucasian means, we obtain an average of 83.3 cubic inches. These averages are quite a bit larger than the Negroid and Negro averages Morton provides. Couple this with the fact that Morton didn't take into account the sexes of the skulls. The white skulls were majority male, while the black skulls were female by a substantial percentage. If we correct the number by sex, the black male average is 87.5, larger than the white male average of 86.5. These differences that favored whites in Morton's original results are made even worse by the very selective rounding of numbers Morton did, rounding up for whites and down for blacks. In the end, this was nothing but an ideological justification of class-based relations. Sure, they spoke of Asiatics and Hindus, with passing statements about their inferiority or other negative traits. The real meat of this research was toward the justification of slavery, particularly in the United States. An example of this would be drapetomania, a mental disease coined by some physicians of the time. Drapetomania was the disease responsible that caused slaves to want to run away, supposedly. They couldn't wrap their heads around why they would want to run away, so they came up with a disease for that desire. The reasoning being that blacks are less intelligent, and hence equal to the intellect of white children. Cartwright, an American physician, wrote, "Like children, they, meaning slaves, are constrained by unalterable physiological laws to love those in authority over them. Hence, from a law of his nature, the Negro can no more help loving a kind master than the child can help loving her that gives it suck." Now, that's enough about Morton, even though there's a lot more to say. Continuing the strange fascination that racialists have with skull and brain measuring, let's introduce Robert Bennett Bean, a US physician that published a long and detailed article comparing the brains of American blacks and whites in 1906. Supposedly, he found undisputable proof that white brains were superior everywhere he looked. Let's dispute that proof then. First of all, let me familiarize you with the premises he worked under. The brain consists of two hemispheres, with a structure called the corpus callosum connecting the two. The brain also consists of four lobes, the frontal, at the front obviously, parietal, temporal, and occipital, at the back. The frontal lobe is responsible for, among other things, cognitive function. The parietal lobe manages information about senses and movement. The occipital lobe is responsible for vision. The temporal lobe manages memories and their interaction with other senses. For example, smell a particular food and you'll remember that trip you took to Morocco 10 years ago or something. The understanding of the time, however, was slightly different. The frontal lobe was considered to be solely responsible for higher mental function, while the occipital was considered to be solely responsible for sensory motoric capacities. Bean's belief was that, logically, the race with the larger average frontal lobe would be more civilized and developed, and the race more barbaric and uncivilized would have a larger occipital lobe. Coming back to the corpus callosum, Bean measured the relative sizes of the front portion and back portion of that corpus callosum. What he found, conveniently, was that whites have a larger front portion, where the seat of intelligence is. This is a nonsense term by modern standards. Blacks, inversely, had smaller, and hence we can extrapolate that they are less intelligent. Funnily enough, Bean also extended this to the sexes, apparently proving that women were less intelligent as well since they had smaller front portions than men. As some of you may have noticed, however, another criteria is missing. The old favorite of racialists, brain size. Well, by this time, it turns out that some have accepted the fact that black and white brains are the same size. There was an out, though. Maybe it wasn't the brain size, but differing sizes of brain components between races that proved white superiority. For example, blacks were deficient in intelligence because their occipital lobes were larger and frontal lobes smaller than whites. Negroes are between man and the orangutan. The Negro is primarily affectionate, immensely emotional, then sensual and under stimulation, passionate. There is love of ostentation and capacity for melodious articulation. There is undeveloped artistic power and taste. Negroes make good artisans, handicraftsmen, and there is instability of character incident to lack of self-control, especially in connection with sexual relation, and there's lack of orientation, or recognition of position and condition of self and environment, evidenced by peculiar bumptiousness, so-called that is particularly noticeable. One would naturally expect some such character for the Negro, because the whole posterior part of the brain is large, and the whole anterior portion is small. Here, Bean is saying prejudice nonsense. Basically, the old version of, yeah, blacks are stupid, but they sure can sing and play basketball. Except, 100 years ago, they said melodious articulation and capable handicraftsmen. Bean's data was so groundbreaking that an editorial in the journal American Medicine in 1907 said the anatomical basis for the complete failure of Negro schools to impart higher studies, the brain cannot comprehend them any more than a horse can understand the rule of three. Leaders in all political parties now acknowledge the error of human equality. It may be practicable to rectify the error and remove a menace to our prosperity, a large electorate without brains. Essentially, blacks were too stupid to be allowed to vote. Let's take a look at the plot graph again. It looks good. Almost too good. Well, if you thought that, you weren't the only one. Franklin B. Mall, Bean's mentor at Johns Hopkins University, also was skeptical and decided to repeat the study. He did so with one change. He made sure he didn't know which were brains of blacks and which were brains of whites. The results? Take a look. As you can see, no difference. Clearly, Bean was not making an objective study, but setting out to prove a previously held bias he had. As incorrect and dishonest as Bean was, though, the findings of his study persisted well into the 1970s. This confusion regarding brain and head measuring continues, however. Eminent scientists such as Pierre-Paul Broca, a physician that placed his name on the section of the brain responsible for speech production, are definitely not below throwing mud at a wall and seeing if it sticks. Funnily enough, I recently had a patient with Broca's aphasia. Now, two things will be of interest here. The cranial index and measurements of the foramen magnum. Let's deal with the cranial index first. This simple measurement was the ratio of maximum width to maximum length of the skull. Those with a ratio of 0.75 or less were referred to as dolichocephalic. Those shorter skulls with a ratio of 0.8 or higher were called brachycephalic. This was popularized by the Swedish scientist Anders Retzius. Of course, the claim was that Nordic and Germanic people were dolichocephalic and hence more intelligent. This upset French scientists as they were brachycephalic, and hence refused to affirm that belief that brachycephaly was a trait of less intelligent races. Of course, only because they too exhibited the trait. The biggest problem of the Cranial Index, however, was this. African blacks and Australian Aborigines were dolichocephalic. Not only this, but they were the longest skulled people in the world. Hilariously, they tried to work around this by claiming that blacks only had larger skulls because they have larger occipital lobes and smaller frontal lobes, remember, apparently a sign of lesser intelligence, thus extending their skull further backwards and hence resulting in longer skulls. As for French brachycephaly, well, that was only because French people had wider faces. Apparently nothing to do with the supposed lack of intelligence or frontal lobe mass. The mental gymnastics are admirable, I'll give them that. Now the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is a hole at the base of our skull where the spinal cord passes through. Why is this interesting? Well, in embryology of mammals, the foramen magnum is originally at the base of the skull, but then migrates to a position behind the skull. The human foramen magnum doesn't migrate much at all though, as it must stay at the base of the skull so you can stand on your two legs, stand upright and look around normally. In apes, the foramen magnum is not at the base of the skull, but also not behind the skull fully, like in other mammals. Instead, it's in between these two positions. As you may already suspect, of course, the racialists will try to spin this in a way where blacks are closer to apes due to the position of their foramen magnums being more in the middle position, while whites obviously will have their foramen magnums right at the base of the skull. After reading about this for a while, you start to see it coming a mile away. This was hotly debated at one point, with some like Pritchard saying there's no difference between blacks and whites, while racialists like Verret showing grades where the more superior races had a more forward positioned foramen magnum. Broca, the French physician already discussed, decided to find the truth on the matter once and for all. He got a bunch of skulls, as these guys usually do, and began measuring. The results? Again, conveniently, blacks had foramen magnums more posterior, while whites had foramen magnums more anteriorly positioned. However, the original argument was that the measurement was only the relative position of the foramen magnum on the cranium itself, not to the face projecting in front of the cranium. Broca realized this, and decided to redo his measurements to clear this debate. The results? Blacks had more anteriorly facing foramen magnums than whites. By their own arbitrary rules, this meant that blacks were superior to whites. Now, did they admit this? Of course not. Instead, they changed the criteria, yet again. More anteriorly facing foramen magnums didn't mean that blacks were more superior, it instead meant that they lacked anterior brain power. Relative to whites, blacks have lost a lot, supposedly, in the frontal lobe department, and gained in the occipital lobe, thus almost moving the cranium back with the position of the foramen magnum remaining the same. Voila! A false appearance of black advantage. The anterior cranial projection of whites surpasses that of Negroes by 4.9%. Thus, while the foramen magnum of Negroes is further back with respect to their incisors, Broca's most forward point in his anterior measure that included the face, it is, on the contrary, further forward with respect to the anterior edge of their brain. To change the cranium of a white into that of a Negro, we would have not only to move the jaw forward, but also to reduce the front of the cranium, that is, to make the anterior brain atrophy and to give, as insufficient compensation, part of the material extracted to the posterior cranium. In other words, in Negroes, the facial and occipital regions are developed to the detriment of the frontal region. Beautiful flip-flopping, seen yet again. Of course, sexism goes hand in hand with racism. Huschke, a German anthropologist, said, "The Negro brain possesses a spinal cord of the type found in children and women, and, beyond this, approaches the type of brain found in higher apes." Hervé, a colleague of Broca, said, "Men of the black races have a brain scarcely heavier than that of a white woman." These negative views from those in and around Broca would eventually lead to influencing such figures like Mussolini, who admired Gustave Le Bon of the Broca school. Sadly, this topic isn't within the scope of this video. Continuing on, we see a new phenomenon begin, that of recapitulation. Very briefly, recapitulation in the social Darwinist sense is the idea that since evolution happens in steps, those steps of younger, more developed organisms resemble adult forms of less developed organisms. In a more concrete example, the adults of inferior groups must be like children of superior groups, because the child represents a primitive adult ancestor. Yet, even more concretely, in the minds of these racists, if adult blacks and women are like white male children, then they are living representatives of an ancestral stage in the evolution of white males. Essentially, this was a system of ranking race not only by brains and heads, but by entire bodies. E.D. Cope, a celebrated American paleontologist that helped develop the theory of recapitulation, divided 4 inferior stages of human development of white male children. That is, non-white populations, all women, Southern Europeans, as opposed to the supposedly superior Northern Europeans, and lower classes within the superior race. Cope was a heavy proponent of the idea of Nordic supremacy and heavily supported attempts at preventing Jewish and inferior European migration to the US. His justification was, apparently, that warmer climates cause premature maturation of all faculties, including mental. As a result, male Southern Europeans have more female and infantile cognitive abilities than the superior Northerners in colder climates. G. Stanley Hill, America's leading psychologist at the time, said, "Most savages in most respects are children, or, because of sexual maturity, more properly adolescents of adult size." This was said by a leading scientist in a supposedly highly developed country in 1904. Remember, this isn't 500 years ago, this isn't ancient history, this is 115 years ago, almost living memory. Looking at this through a materialist lens, we can easily see the farce for what it really is, a disgusting justification of imperialism. Benjamin Kidd, a prominent social Darwinist, extended the argument to justify colonial expansion into tropical Africa. We are dealing with peoples who represent the same stage in the history of the development of the race that the child does in the history of the development of the individual. The tropics will not therefore be developed by the natives themselves. How incredibly convenient. The poet of imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, even included recapitulation theory into his famous poem of The White Man's Burden. "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve the captive's need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." No more is it more obvious that recapitulation theory is nothing but a thinly disguised attempt at justifying imperialism than in a letter from Teddy Roosevelt to Henry Cabot Lodge, in which he said, "The verse was very poor poetry, but made good sense from the expansion point of view." The greatest irony is that after the 1920s, the theory of recapitulation collapsed and was replaced by a theory of neoteny, which stated the exact opposite. Under neoteny, more infantile features were shared between human children and baby apes. However, as apes grew into adulthood, these similarities quickly disappear. Now, the implication is the more infantile a race is, the more developed and less ape-like it is. To quote Gold, under recapitulation, adults of inferior races are like children of superior races. Under neoteny, superior groups retain their childlike characteristics as adults, while inferior groups pass through the higher phase of childhood and then degenerate towards apishness. Now, consider the conventional prejudice of white scientists. Whites are superior, blacks are inferior. Under recapitulation, black adults should be like white children, but under neoteny, white adults should be like black children. Louis Polk, the main proponent of the neoteny theory, conveniently doesn't mention something interesting. Women tend to have more physically infantile features than men, hence they'd logically be more developed, superior. Asians tend to retain a youthful appearance for longer, and many Asian men can't grow full beards. These features could also be considered physically infantile, making them superior. He, of course, conveniently never made such a connection. Neoteny is still semi-alive in some circles today, as influential British psychologist H.J. Eysenck used it to argue for black inferiority in his 1971 work. Of course, he was utterly wrong. Honestly, this video could go on forever. There is no shortage of scientists, physicians, philosophers, and other appeal to authority types that believed, built upon, and peddled this nonsense. However, I think I've done enough to show not only how the history itself is disgusting and hypocritical, but how it's also riddled with data fudging, ridiculous biases, and just outright nonsense. This is not the end of the story, however. Subscribe to be informed on when I upload the next videos, where I'll talk about why racists are wrong about race and the consequences of these beliefs. If you enjoyed what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really helps. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank Zarian Arsen, Xiaoyan Zhang, Laurie Valdemar Minialo, Khan, Daryl McFarlane,